Ferrari has given us one of the most exciting launch cars of the season. And in this video, we're going to go from the front to the back of the car, talking about all the little aero bits and what they could potentially be doing on the car. For those of you that are new to my channel, I was an aerodynamicist for Mercedes for the 2018, 19, and 20 Formula 1 seasons, and I now work as an aerodynamics consultant, designing race car aerodynamics packages for cars all around the world. Now, a lot of the commentary around this car has seemed to focus quite heavily on the side pods, and while they're a very interesting feature, I feel like it's distracted a lot of people from some of the very interesting other features that are on the car, particularly around the mid-floor, where there's some really cool stuff going on. Anyway, we've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Now, of course, this analysis comes with a standard disclaimer that this car is a launch car, and therefore we don't know that these are 100% the details that are going to rock up to test or even race one. But I do think that Ferrari has genuinely showed a lot of its details and conceptual features in this release. Now let's start with the front wing. Now, objectively, this is probably the least interesting part of the car, and that's actually quite a statement on how interesting the rest of the car is, because there's still quite a few things to talk about on the front wing. This is the first time that we've seen the nose cone run into the first element of the front wing, at least on a car that I believe is a legitimate representation. And as a result, this wing looks very different along the center line, particularly through this portion here. Now, if we look at where the trailing edge of the element ends, just in there, what we can see is that this particular region must have some degree of step or kick on the underside. So obviously we've got our wing element that comes through like this, and then as we get to the rearwards portion, there must be some form of sharp turn up. Either the nose has to kink and crink up quite a bit, or there's got to be some sort of step that they've filleted out. Basically, there looks like there's some form of fairly aggressive curvature under there to make this implementation work. Now, any sort of kick in this region would create local suction. Basically, we've got the equivalent of a little mini diffuser kick along there. We would get more suction in this particular region here. And I do have my suspicions based on previous cars that we are potentially front limited. However, it's worth noting that any aggressive curvature in this region would create some more boundary layer losses than having a really smooth blend through here, and certainly more than having a slat with a slot gap at the front. So from that perspective, I would guess that they're trading a little bit of centerline loading for a little bit of loss. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there's something they could play about with as the season progresses, because aerodynamically for the whole car, changing out this bit to a disconnected front element that we see on other teams wouldn't be a total game changer. We'd just see a bit of loss cleanup, and it wouldn't completely alter the aerodynamics the whole way down the car. So maybe we'll see that change for test, maybe we'll see them run some different noses, maybe we'll see them change it through the season. At the moment though, I would be very surprised if Ferrari hadn't at least run a disconnected front element in the tunnel, so maybe they just find that the forward load gain is worth it. Looking a bit further back, you can see that the nose is fairly soft in its curvature compared to some other competitors on the grid. Now, it's not quite as soft as the Williams, but it's definitely softer than a lot of the teams that are running sharper and squarer noses. Now, as I discussed on the Williams video, this could be a bit of an effort to reduce any sort of corner losses that could be coming off here that could potentially be ingested by the floor further downstream. Now, getting back to the front wing, as I mentioned before, the central portion is quite heavily center loaded. So we're loaded heavily through here, and then we back off towards the outside. Now, this wing to me doesn't look like it's generating as much span-wise flow compared to some of the other wings we've seen, for example, the Alfa Romeo. If you have a look at these stays and their alignment, they're fairly straightforward. There's nothing too crazy going on there. And I think one of the most interesting things about the Ferrari front wing is that compared to everyone else on the grid, their little flat pivot vanes are much smaller. And to top it off, they're more or less aligned in the direction of their stays. They've obviously got a little bit of curvature in them, so they're probably shedding a tiny bit of vorticity, but I hazard a guess that they're just not shedding the same sort of amount that we're seeing on some of the other cars. Of course, this comes with a little bit of a caveat, which is if you have a look on the wings, you'll see that there's this little bit of carbon look tape at each point on the flap that's holding the flap up and together. And you'll also know that there is no actual flap adjuster pod. Now, there's two explanations for this. One is just that they didn't get it finished in time, maybe the part wasn't ready, they didn't bond it on, they needed to get the car out, so they just threw this on. The other one is that maybe they're trying something a little bit fancy with the flap adjuster, and that may not necessarily be the flap adjuster geometry itself, but it's worth noting that this pivot goes for two elements, not just one. They're using the maximum number allowed by the rules, and maybe they're planning on cranking this to a level above or below the elements around it to shed a little bit more vorticity. Now, the curvature of the wing doesn't specifically imply that, so this is definitely a lot of conjecture, but it's just interesting to note that that particular device is missing when it is something that wouldn't be too hard to prepare and fit to the wing. Having a look out at the end plates, you'll note they've got a bit of a bulge in the center. Now, it's not as extreme as what we've been seeing on some of the other teams, where we've been seeing some very cranked trailing edges in the center, and then they get a little bit more backed off towards the tips. But it does look like a much more subtle implementation. And I do wonder if the Ferrari implementation is perhaps a little bit more aimed at getting a little bit of extra span on the dive plane, more so than it is for cranking up the central portion of the end plate. It's worth noting, though, that the top edge does seem to be fairly backed off in terms of the trailing edge position is quite outboard, so it makes me think that they're still following the philosophy that we've seen on a lot of teams of trying to cast the top edge vortex outboard. While on the dive plane, you'll note that it goes almost the full length of the legality box, and it's quite backed off and fairly low down in the box canard. It's not like it's one of those crazy S-bend ones we're seeing, where we're seeing a really cranked up canard in the forward portion. It's really quite gentle through that area. So perhaps to make their downstream bodywork work better with the wheel wake, they might be trying to aim to shed the vortex a little bit lower along here than some of the other designs that would kind of imply that they're shedding it a little bit higher. Because it's a constantly curving upwards dive plane and the slope is quite gentle, it would probably shed quite a clean vortex as well, which would probably be quite persistent downstream. Now, looking back at the front suspension, we can see it has quite an interesting layout where the tie rod is divorced from the upper and lower wishbones. Now, we talked a bit in previous videos about how some cars are going for a high track rod or tie rod and others are going for a low one, but the Ferrari approach is very different. It's quite divorced and in the middle of the airstream. Now, at first glance from an aero perspective, you would say that's not actually a beneficial thing. Obviously, if we have any sort of vorticity that's trying to pass between the control arms, it just gives another point where we could potentially collide that vorticity in, so you've got less room there. It's not going to sort of shadow and work as a cascade with any of the other elements, so at face value, it kind of doesn't make sense until you look at it from a more three-dimensional view. Now, there's a few things going on here. The first thing to note is that the cladding for the wishbones is pretty massive. We've got a really sizable chord length in this cladding here. And then if we look at the tie rod, it also has really sizable chord length in the cladding as well. So I imagine that we are close to legality on both of these for cladding size. The next thing to note is how high this particular pickup point sits with respect to the wheel. So obviously these are larger rims and wheels this year, but they're not infinitely large. And if you actually just trace the line where the rim would roughly be around there, you can see that our pickup point on the upright must be pretty close to the top end of that particular point. Now, obviously, as we arc in a circle, if the tie rod has to be forwards of that point, we have to move down a little bit. So that's one potential mechanical thing. But another thing is that the total area from this setup, by having everything at maximum chord, probably allows you to have a lot more area for downwashing, which, as we've discussed before, is useful for trying to pressurize this whole region, suppress the lower tire wake a little bit, and help with washing everything out. It also helps turn the upwash from the wing down a little bit so that it's a little bit more level or downwashing by the time it hits the floor leading edge, and we can gain more suction from the floor. Now, you may ask me, how are these elements downwashing if they look quite flat? Well, the thing is, it's all relative, right? So if I have a flat airfoil like that, and I have an upwashing airflow like that kicked off the front wing, then this airfoil is the same as having a flat airflow with a wing that's then angled downwashing. So this is why I keep referring to this area as downwashing. Now, obviously, without seeing their upright, we can't confirm my speculation on the packaging of how the tie rod mounts into there. But what we can see is that we do have a lot of long chord suspension elements here, and I would hazard a guess that we are doing a lot of that downwashing action. Now let's move to the first juicy part of the car, which is the mid-floor. Now, it's worth noting that when you enhance the release images, that Ferrari actually went through here and put a little blanked out region on either side of the image, so you couldn't see what was going on from the front. So they were obviously trying to hide these details. However, unfortunately for them, they also released a video, and you can see an awful lot in that. Starting with the T-tray, they've gone for the Aston Martin style double T-tray, and this is the first proper look that we've got at it. I speculated in the Aston Martin video that it could be either upwashing or downwashing, and if you have a look at the Ferrari version just here, it's clearly very heavily upwashing. So what we're going to have happen along here is that we're going to generate a vortex that's going to roll up this way along there, some form of vorticity there. In fact, it will probably start tracking a little bit higher up as it goes downstream, which will slightly weaken the vortices on the edge of the bib and will also add vorticity to the floor inlet, particularly a little bit higher up. However, I think it's the second device in here that's quite an interesting one, because I believe these two devices work in pair quite well. And what it is that it appears that they have used one of their strakes as a half-height strake just here. This is a shot I grabbed from the video, and you'll see that we can actually see a fair bit in it. Now, if you'll remember the rules from my earlier videos, you're allowed to have up to 4 strakes, but you are allowed some freedom of where you put these strakes within a defined box. So what we can see in the Ferrari video is that we have the outboard barge board, the outer strake here, that's strake 1. Then we have 2, 3 strakes at full length to the floor. And then you can actually see up here, that's the half strake there. So you can see it casting its little shadow over there. And you can see the T-tray just there. So this strake is almost certainly outwashing. It's almost certainly going that way. And what that will mean is that it will shed vorticity that's spinning off to the inboard side here, which will be in the same direction as the vorticity shed off the bottom of the double T-tray. These two vortices should wrap up and merge with each other further downstream, and I'm sure that positioning those quite high up, which is what this layout would kind of do, would generate a lot of suction and induced load on the roof of the forward floor tunnel. It's a good way too of generating a vortex in an area that's not really covered by the lower floor strakes, because these generate their vortices near the ground and then they have to work their way into the tunnel further back. This fills an area that probably doesn't have a lot of vorticity in it otherwise and probably could benefit from some vorticity. So that's a super neat way of handling that particular region. Okay, now let's get into the thing that everyone's talking about, the bodywork. This is probably the most complex bodywork we've seen flow-wise, and it took me quite a bit of time to crystallize my thoughts and work out exactly how it could be operating. Now, with any of these complex surfaces, it's worth noting that a person cannot just look at the surface and have a perfect understanding of how the airflows are moving. But there are certainly a lot of details that can give us some hints on what's going on here. The Ferrari inlet certainly isn't as rammed up to the front of the box as we've seen on some of the others. For example, we've been able to keep some smooth blends through here rather than just having dead sharp corners. However, judging by the fact that this particular portion is square and then we sweep into an angled portion, I'm going to hazard a guess that they are pretty close to the edge of the box. And you can see that a little bit better on this side here. It's not the tallest inlet we've seen, but it probably is the widest. And a large amount of this is probably to allow them to maximize the wing-like effects of this upper section and this lower section, because they're essentially running them as aero surfaces that are not really that dissimilar to wings. The side view curvature of the undercut is quite aggressive downwashing. Now you can see it more or less follows the profile of the floor, it's just a little bit more aggressive. Now this should pressurize the forward floor here, so we should get a little bit more positive pressure here. We should also suppress any losses that could be coming off or any separations that could be coming off the top of the floor, but we'll get a lot of pressurization here and that will propagate forwards and cause additional downwash onto the floor leading edge. The pressurization will also help kick the tire wake outboards. We know from previous videos that this can be a pretty handy feature. Now, this particular downwashing feature is not dissimilar to the Aston Martin approach. They had a downwashing floor at the forwards edge. However, when you look at the lateral curvature, the Ferrari differs quite substantially. Basically, in addition to the downwash, the Ferrari also has a huge amount of outwash here, and this is a shape that's not too dissimilar to the older barge boards that ran on previous generations of cars. Now, this combined downwash and outwash from the side pod will really generate a lot more pressure on the top surface here than we would have been seeing on the Aston Martin. So the benefits of that, obviously more downwash and more wake kicking out. Now, more downwash on the floor leading edge has the benefit of inducing more suction on the floor leading edge. So what's the downside to this technique? Well, if we're outwashing here, we actually have to curve the flow back and turn it back in here. So you can see that it's got to work its way around this particular corner here, which is relatively sharp. It's not insane, but it's relatively sharp for the flow to turn from that angle back that way. And so every time we go through a section of curvature, that naturally results in some losses being generated. So we will generate some losses and essentially boundary layer thickening of any clean flow that's traveling down the side. So any clean flow that we've induced from the center, we kick that out and then we try to keep it attached down the side, we'll get a little bit of loss along here. In comparison, the Aston of course doesn't have this double curvature. It goes and flows straight through underneath and flows through to the back that way. So the flow's got to go through a lot less curvature, it's easier to keep it clean. However, without that additional pressurization at the front, you'd have to think that it's never going to kick out the front wheel wake as hard. So it's a bit of a rearrangement of losses that we're seeing here, because we've got Aston with a very clean flow inboards, Ferrari with presumably a clean flow that's going to be running along the outboard portion over here as a layer of clean flow, and then the Ferrari wake will be further out, the Aston wake will be a little bit further in. Just a note on the corner losses too is that it's highly unlikely that Ferrari would ship anything to the track that would have any sort of heavy separations in this region. So I think it's fairly safe to assume that they've got the curvature at such a curve where the flow is all going to stay nice and attached. In saying that, this general concept of bodywork will be more susceptible to separation around this region than a traditional style undercut. Another benefit of the outwash that's generated by this side pod would be that it would power up this particular floor curl here. Now, powering up that curl would lead to more suction along here that would propagate into the floor, so we get more suction through the whole forward floor. Again, with the suspicion that the car's front limited, this would be a beneficial feature. We still haven't seen the floor edge wing make an appearance on this car, so perhaps there's still more coming in terms of what they plan to do with this region. Maybe they're going to add a cranked flap on the edge here, or maybe they've got something else in mind. Moving a bit higher up, we can see that after the initial outwashing portion, that this particular portion from here to here of the side pod looks like it's almost flat up against legality. If you look at this legality box diagram, it seems that what they're doing is that they've got pretty much at legality here, bit of curvature through there, sweeping back there, and then they're more or less at legality through this particular portion along here. You can see that the bodywork is inset from the floor a bit to be at legality, and then it looks like they're then tapering it back in quite hard at the rear. You can see in this side shot how much it is flared over the edge, and also in this side shot here. So it sticks out to legality, then it tapers in quite harshly at the rear, not hugely dissimilar to the Aston Martin in that particular respect. Now, some people have been speculating, I think Scarb's posted this up, that there's potentially a more radical radiator layout inside the Ferrari. Now, I'd say that that's more effect than cause, because they could easily run the previous generation radiator layout, so I'd say that any choices here were made primarily for external aero, but it's certainly something you can think about, whether they'd be running a radiator front back at an angle like that, maybe a steeper angle there, or running a sideways style radiator layout that runs along the length of the car. I would say the most likely thing they're doing with this particular aero strategy is that they've done their job kicking the wake out at the front, so the tyre wake's sitting quite far outboard, and then they're holding it along the side of the car without curving it in. They're keeping that as wide as possible, and then at the rear, they're then kicking in quite hard with the bodywork. And what that's going to do is it will drag in the tyre wake, but only just at the last minute, and they've done a good job of kicking it out in the first place, so it might get the tyre wake just crash onto the face of the rear tyre, which all in all is not a super bad thing, because in a way, it's not dissimilar to having a fairing in front of your rear tyre. While the more aggressive curvature at the rear could increase the losses in the rearwards undercut and the rearwards bodywork curvature there, it might help keep the front wheel wake outboard for longer and stop it rotating in or being drawn in by the bodywork, something that might happen if you ran a more tapered design that would come in like that. It might draw that wake in a little bit earlier or rotate it down onto the floor. The time has now come to talk about the top surface, because I think that's what has the most people most interested. Now, to me, what it looks like is it's an approach that's all about trying to keep the cooling losses up as high as physically possible and along the center line as physically possible, maximizing clean airflow around the sides and underneath through here. Now, generally speaking, when we define louvers, we would try and make it so that each subsequent louver follows the air path of the one before it. Now, the idea behind this is that you don't spread your losses out sideways, because obviously if you had airflow going
something like this way down here, you'd end up with loss here that gets blown that way, loss here gets blown that way, loss here that way, that way, that way, and then you just end up with a giant sheet of loss, which is generally speaking not a great idea. So one hint we can take from that is that the airflow direction along the surface here probably follows the contour of the louvers. This to me shows a bit of inwash and upwash. Now for conventional side pods, air typically makes its way down as you move towards the rear of the car, it gets drawn down. However, Ferrari has essentially created a giant inwashing sausage with the outer part of the bodywork. Now they can't use an actual vane or anything like that because the bodywork rules are fairly specific about the radii you can use. You can go no tighter than 70 millimeters convex or 50 millimeters concave. So they can't just put a big old vane along here and wash in that way. But what they've got should largely achieve the same intent. Now the obvious question is, what happens to the clean air that's coming in over the top of the side pod? Because obviously if we were drawing it down here, we then are venting cooling air, which would kick things off, so that we'd have like a boundary layer of sorts of cooling air working its way along this way, like that. So we'd have our cooling air coming along there. And then we've got to think about where our clean air would go. So our clean air, I'm thinking, might go straight over the top of that and then get sucked in sort of a helical motion into the divot, because there's the curvature of the divot is still going down, so we can have an off-body flow that's going down into the divot. And then this whole sideways portion that's inwashing will guide this air down, around, and that way. And then we're going to get a bit of an overall bulk rotation of the flows that way as this sort of helical structure is coming through. Now you've got to remember too that as this air comes down to the divot is having some curvature in an upwards direction, so we'd end up getting some high pressure from the air here as it's turned around and up, and that pressure field will also continue to force any sort of louver losses up. I mean, in an ideal world, we'd have these louver losses get kicked up and actually run over the top of the wing. Now I don't think that they're actually achieving that. I don't even know that that is achievable with the amount of upwash that's available here, but they're presumably maneuvering them into a much more favorable position. Now it's worth noting that this whole upwash theory is further supported by the kick that we can see at their suspension aperture. Technically speaking, they're not meant to be venting any cooling further forwards than 55 millimeters in front of the rear axle, apart from, of course, the allowed louvers. But this upwards kick here is a clever interpretation of the suspension aperture rules, and it obviously allows them to vent a little bit of cooling air, but also kick any of the air on the top upwards. So this sort of feeds into that suspicion that they're really trying to upwash everything back here. And you can clearly see in this rearwards shot how the louvers are really pulling in through there. Now, as I mentioned before, I don't think they could upwash towards the rear wing or anything like that. And you can see that towards the end of the louver, they're probably starting to get a little bit more downwashing there. But I think that we're still fairly close to the mark with the way that the flows are being predicted through that region. And you'd certainly think we get your cooling exit flow closer to the center line than the Aston Martin approach. So that's the side pods explained, well, at least the best explanation that I can come up with for them. So let's talk a little bit about some more straightforward floor detailing stuff, because again, we've got some details here that we just haven't seen on other teams. The real one that I'd like to point out is this bulbous section through here. Now you actually have a look, that's part of the floor edge. That's actually a kick in this portion here on the floor edge that goes up and then tapers back down to a relatively flat rear at the bottom that looks like it's got a tiny itty bitty curl just there. If we look at this side view just below the side pod and assume that the lower surface of the floor matches the upper surface, which quite frankly we have to because we don't really have anything else to go on, you can see this kick just here. So you can see the roof comes up there to what I assume is the top of the floor edge legality box. You can see that it comes on the inboard side there, kinks up there like that. So effectively what they're doing here is they're getting a wider diffuser kick further forwards, because even if they're kicking their floor tunnel up a little bit on the inboard portion, the outboard would still be flat in a conventional car, whereas they've gone and cranked this up and they should get a decent amount of suction at the base here. Again, preferencing the suction in that forward floor portion, because obviously the bit where this is all curving back and reflexing down is going to generate a little bit of pressure compared to if it was just dead flat. So this to me looks like they're preferencing again that forward floor suction, which seems to be something that this car is heavily biased around. Certainly an interesting detail though, and not one that we've seen on other teams. Another detail that is similar to what we've seen on other teams is the diffuser sidewall cutout just here. Now this seems that it's becoming a relatively standard feature, like I mentioned in some of my previous videos, but the Ferrari is a little bit more aggressive a cutout than some of the others. We've got a slightly more aggressive slope and taper on the front leading edge of the sidewall strake there, and we also have what appears to be a slightly larger cutout in terms of a flatter top. Some of the other teams seem to more go and taper the top edge of the cutout sort of forwards like that. So quite an aggressive strategy there, but again, a similar strategy to what's being used by some other teams. Some other details to note is we have some interesting wingletage going on the halo. We have a forward winglet that is outwashing, and then a rearwards winglet that actually appears to be inwashing. I'll go to another angle for a better look at this. So you can see there, that's very clearly an outwashing winglet, so that's going to shed a vortex that away, although to be honest with you, it will probably actually drift more in this direction over here. And then this rearward winglet, there's going to presumably be some outwash component going on here, but if you have a look at the edge, it's curled over like that, which usually indicates that they are housing a vortex on that curled over side. So that to me implies that this winglet is probably inwashing instead of outwashing. So maybe they set up the flow by outwashing up high, and then this captures it as well as a bit of outwash here. Now this vortex here might just help spin some of these losses and keep them from going further down, keep the cockpit losses a little bit high. That would be my expectation of what it could be doing, although it is certainly an interesting setup by having two opposite signed vortex generators. While we're looking from the back, you'll note that the engine cover has a very slim inlet for the top. Now, given the very small nature of this inlet, it's likely that either the majority or all of this inlet is being used just for the engine intake air, and we're managing the cooling predominantly through the side pods. Just another detail appreciation point here is when you look at the outlets of the cooling louvers, you can actually see they actually flare out the tops and the bottoms and make them into a fully profiled edge where it meets back in. And that's really to give it a good acceptance to any cooling flows that could be spilling out that way like that, in addition to the flows that are obviously spilling out that way like that. It's just an example of the sort of detailing that goes into an F1 car to make sure that losses are minimized and aero efficiency is maximized. Finally, I'd just like to point out a little detail on the rear wing end plate. It seems that the Ferrari has the most aggressive cutout of anyone we've seen thus far, really bring the end plate cutout forwards. Now, I imagine that what they're doing here is they're controlling any sort of losses in the end plate wing junction, and they could also perhaps get a little bit of vorticity around the back here and onto the back edge of the flap, which might make it just hold on a little bit longer, and then they can crank it that little bit harder. This might tie into the fact that their beam wing strategy is relatively interesting. It looks like they've got a fairly cranked mid portion of the beam wing, although arguably they've got a pretty big old slot gap to the diffuser there, but the outboard portion is super backed off. You can see that we've got a lot of twist in this region here, and we've really opened up the gaps between the elements there. So really backed off there. That's probably to do with managing the diffuser edge, and maybe even they're trying to adjust the loading and exit pressures of the cake tin and the diffuser, and maybe even a little bit of playing around with vorticity and span-wise flow. But if this beam wing is not cranked, there's less support up here. You would need to have a slightly more robust rear wing through this portion here. So maybe that's a reflection of that particular strategy. Now, just a final note. Lots of people have been asking me to say if this aero concept in car is any good or not. What I will say is this. It is a concept and an interesting one. Nothing more, nothing less. Personally, I like it. I think it's a cool implementation. That is not the same as me saying it will have excellent performance. People who say they can predict whether a car will make more or less downforce or drag from a certain concept are largely lying to you unless they have specifically taken that concept to the tunnel and know its full characteristics, and even then, it still depends on the detailing applied to it. Two cars with the same concept do not always make the same downforce, and two cars with two different concepts can make exactly the same downforce. And a huge amount of that is down to the skills of the aerodynamicists at each team and the tools they have to work with. I hope this answers that question for all the people asking it.
Well, that's all for this analysis. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Leave a comment below on what videos you'd like to see next from me, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.